The date is October 14th, 1943. The location is the skies above Schweinfurt, Germany. American daylight bombers, the pride of the United States Army Air Force, are being slaughtered. 400 B-17 flying fortresses, each carrying 10 men, are pushing deeper into the German heartland when they vanish. Not in a single moment, but wave after wave, torn apart by Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s that swarm out of the clouds with a precision born from 3 years of aerial combat expertise. That day, 60 American bombers would not return home. 600 men dead, another 100 captured, over 17,000 tons of explosive capacity lost in a single mission. The survivors spoke of defensive gunfire so concentrated it felt like flying through a solid wall of lead. They spoke of Me-109 pilots who knew exactly where to attack. They spoke of cannon fire that split through fuselages like butter. But there was one failure that haunted every pilot who made it back. The escorting fighters, the American P-47 Thunderbolts, couldn't follow the bombers deep enough into Germany. They ran out of fuel. 35,000 feet above Schweinfurt, the bomber crews watched their protectors turn back toward England, watching them shrink into specks against the sky, watching the swarm of Luftwaffe fighters close in from every angle. What the Americans didn't know was that the Luftwaffe had already moved its best units, the veterans who'd been flying since Poland, since France, since North Africa. These weren't conscripted boys. These were pilots who could put bullets through an enemy aircraft from angles that seemed physically impossible. They flew with what they called Deflectionsschießen, deflection shooting, a technique so difficult, so mathematically demanding, that American fighter pilots claimed it was beyond human capacity to master. The statistics tell the brutal story. American fighter losses on escort missions were running 40%. German fighter losses were 7%. By the fall of 1943, the Luftwaffe had achieved something that should have been impossible. They'd turned the battle for air superiority into a one-sided rout. At RAF Debden in Essex, England, a single American pilot was watching these numbers. He was scanning the after-action reports. He was reading the testimony of bomber crews. He was calculating casualty ratios on the back of scratch pads. His name was Colonel Donald James Matthew Blakeslee, 26 years old, already a double ace from his service with British Eagle squadrons, and he was about to attempt something the Air Force said couldn't be done. He was going to teach American pilots to deflection shoot, and in doing so, he would transform the entire air war over Europe. To understand why deflection shooting seemed impossible, you have to understand the mathematics of aerial combat. Picture this. You're flying a P-47 Thunderbolt at 370 miles per hour. Your target is a Bf-109 flying perpendicular to you, moving at nearly the same speed. Between you is a distance of 500 yards. You have approximately 3 seconds to make your calculations and fire. During those 3 seconds, both aircraft will cover ground distances of over 1,000 feet. If you aim directly at the enemy fighter, your bullets will arrive at a point in space where the aircraft was, not where it is. You must lead your target. You must estimate the enemy's speed, altitude, angle of bank, and turn rate. You must calculate the time of flight of your ammunition, how long it takes a .50 caliber bullet to reach the target. You must factor in wind, temperature, and the curvature of the earth. And you must make these calculations in your head while pulling 8 Gs of force, while your vision is narrowing from blood redistribution, while your heart is hammering against your ribs, while the enemy is trying to kill you. The official U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine recommended pilots get close, very close, within 100 yards, and simply aim at the enemy aircraft. What was called the 6 o'clock position, dead astern, directly behind the target. The problem was simple. German pilots understood something American pilots didn't. There were many angles from which you could kill an enemy fighter, and deflection shooting, attacking from the side, from above, from every conceivable geometry, multiplied your tactical options by orders of magnitude. The failure was systemic. American pilot training emphasized formations and mutual support. German training emphasized marksmanship. By 1943, the differential was catastrophic. German ace pilots claimed kill ratios of 10-1 against American fighters. The Luftwaffe was winning because they could shoot better. Expert consensus within the Air Force was blunt and discouraging. General James H. Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, received reports from his gunnery officers. Deflection shooting required a level of spatial reasoning that wasn't teachable. It required an innate sense of lead and angle that some pilots had, but most simply didn't possess. Forcing it down the throats of average pilots would only waste fuel and ammunition. There was also the psychological factor. A 19-year-old farm boy from Nebraska flying a fighter for the first time was already terrified. To tell him he needed to master an advanced geometric technique while under extreme stress. The consensus was that it would break pilots psychologically. It would reduce their effectiveness, not improve it. Instead, the Air Force invested in attrition, more bombers, more fighters, more men. If you couldn't win through superior tactics, you'd win through superior firepower. The strategy was brutal and unsustainable. American losses in escort missions continued climbing. The statistics showed that the longer the war went on, the worse American pilots performed relative to their German counterparts because all the experienced American pilots were either dead or rotated home, while German pilots flew until they were killed, accumulating experience with every mission. The stakes were existential. American strategic bombing was the central pillar of the war plan. If German fighters could continue inflicting 37% losses on escort missions, the bombing campaign would collapse. And if the bombing campaign collapsed, the German war machine would continue churning out tanks and planes and weapons. The entire course of the war hung on a simple question. Could American pilots learn to shoot as well as Germans? At Debden, Colonel Blakesley was convinced the answer was yes. What he didn't know was how much resistance he would face, not from the enemy, but from his own command. Donald James Matthew Blakesley was not a natural-born leader. He was not the man you would look at and think, there goes a legendary fighter pilot. He'd grown up in Fairport Harbor, Ohio, the son of a middle-class family. His father worked at a chemical plant. Young Donald had been mesmerized by the Cleveland air races as a boy, but he had no family connections to aviation, no special privileges, no path laid out before him. He'd saved money working odd jobs and bought a Piper Cub airplane with a friend, a basic, fragile aircraft that proved he had passion but not polish. In 1941, desperate to keep flying after that crashed, he'd joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. Just like that, left Ohio, traveled to Canada, got on a ship, crossed the Atlantic. By 1942, he was flying Spitfires with RAF 401 Squadron. By 1943, he'd transferred to the American Eagle Squadron, flying for the United States through a special arrangement. He'd claimed his first kills over the coast of France, damaged enemy aircraft, scored victories, but he'd also earned a reputation that complicated his heroism. He was a mediocre marksman. Fellow pilots remembered his early combat missions. Blakesley would get on the tail of a German fighter close to within range, and his bullets would spray the sky around the target. He'd chase enemy aircraft for miles, expending thousands of rounds with minimal results. Other pilots would slide in beside him, fire a short burst, and the Messerschmitt would come apart. "Blakesley can't shoot," became the whispered refrain. It wasn't disrespect exactly, it was observation. Some pilots had the gift, some didn't. Blakesley had courage and determination, but marksmanship, the skill that seemed to matter most in air combat, he appeared to lack it. But there was something else about him that his superiors noticed. When Blakesley got on an enemy airplane, he didn't give up. When other pilots would break off a chase, Blakesley would pursue deeper into enemy territory. When formations scattered, Blakesley would navigate back to the rendezvous point first. He had a mechanical understanding of air combat that went beyond individual kills. He understood tactics. He understood positioning. He understood angles. By January 1944, he was made commanding officer of the 4th Fighter Group, 438 pilots, divided into 3 squadrons flying out of Debden. The 4th had become American's premier fighter unit, but the losses were still too high. Something had to change. Then came the moment that changed everything. Blakesley was studying gun camera footage, the film cameras mounted on fighter wings that recorded every combat encounter. He was watching a mission debriefing when one pilot described an engagement. The German fighter had attacked from the side, from a 45-degree angle. The pilot described how the German pilot had aimed at a point in space ahead of him, how the bullets had converged exactly where the American aircraft was going to be. Blakesley watched the footage again and again, and suddenly something clicked. It wasn't mystical. It wasn't beyond human capacity. It was mathematics. It was pattern recognition. It was something that could be taught. In February 1944, Blakesley converted a farmhouse near Debden into an unofficial gunnery school. It wasn't authorized. It certainly wasn't official Air Force doctrine. It was something he was doing after hours, using pilots' free time, involving his own equipment modifications. The setup was crude. Blakesley had aircraft mechanics rig up range markers, empty oil drums painted with concentric circles. He had pilots fly at these targets from every conceivable angle. Side approaches, head-on attacks, deflection angles of 30 degrees, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, from above, from below, at different speeds. The key innovation was this. Blakesley taught pilots to think about where the target would be, not where it was. He had them memorize the geometry of lead angles. He had them practice the calculations until they became intuitive, automatic, a reflex rather than conscious thought. He showed them how German pilots had been doing this for years, how there was nothing magical about it, how it was simply practice, discipline, and the willingness to think about air combat differently. Most importantly, he simplified it. Instead of complex trigonometric calculations, Blakesley taught his pilots a basic principle: estimate the distance, estimate the closing speed, estimate the angle, and adjust your aim accordingly. It became a formula, repeatable, teachable, learnable. But here's what made Blakesley different from other commanders. He didn't just teach it, he practiced it alongside his pilots. Every morning the colonel was out there at dawn, flying deflection shooting passes at those oil drums, adjusting his own technique, proving to every pilot that he wasn't asking them to do something he hadn't mastered himself. The first pilots to work with Blakesley's new system were skeptical. They'd been flying the old way for years. They'd learned to trust their instincts. But within weeks, something was happening. Gun camera footage showed dramatic improvement. Bullets were connecting. Missed distances were shrinking from hundreds of feet to mere inches. In early March 1944, Blakesley submitted his findings to 8 Fighter Command Headquarters, a 2-page report detailing the new deflection shooting tactics, the gunnery protocols, the training methodology. The response was immediate and crushing. A staff officer sent back a memo that read, "These tactics are inefficient. They require pilot training beyond that offered in standard Air Force schools. They suggest that previous pilot selection has been inadequate. This cannot be approved." Translation: you're saying our pilots are stupid. You're saying our training is bad. You're saying you know better than Air Force doctrine. You're saying, no. The room at headquarters erupted. The proposal was dismissed as the unauthorized work of an overzealous commander who didn't understand the realities of pilot selection and training methodology. Blakesley was essentially told to drop it, to stop wasting time with unconventional ideas, to focus on flying bombers to Berlin and back. He didn't. 2 weeks later, on March 15, 1944, Blakesley made a calculated move. He requested permission to conduct a public demonstration, a full combat exercise where his deflection shooting trained pilots would engage in mock dogfights against conventionally trained pilots from other fighter groups. He would stake his reputation on the results. The request moved up the chain of command. It reached General James H. Doolittle himself, the legendary Jimmy Doolittle, who'd already been skeptical of unconventional gunnery tactics. Doolittle was supposed to deny it. The request was irregular, unauthorized, and suggested that decades of Air Force training doctrine might be insufficient. But Doolittle was also a realist. He was watching the casualty reports. He was reading the pilot testimonies. He was struggling with the same problem Blakesley had identified. American pilots were dying at rates that strategic bombing couldn't sustain. On March 18, 1944, General Doolittle flew to Debden. The demonstration took place over the Channel, northeast of the airfield. 8 fighters from the 4th Fighter Group, pilots trained in Blakesley's deflection shooting methods, faced off against 8 fighters from a neighboring group, trained in conventional tactics. The mock combat lasted 30 minutes. The rules were simple. Gun camera footage would determine who would have scored kills. The pilots had orders to break off before any actual collision. What General Doolittle witnessed was decisive. Blakesley's pilots scored 17 confirmed gun camera hits. The conventionally trained pilots scored 3. The difference wasn't marginal. It was dominance. It was 5-to-1 superiority. It was proof that what Air Force experts had dismissed as impossible was not only possible, but dramatically superior. When the pilots landed, Doolittle was waiting on the tarmac. According to witnesses, the general walked directly to Blakesley and said 4 words. "Why hasn't this been implemented?" The meeting that followed would change the entire air war. Present were Doolittle, Blakesley, representatives from Waite Fighter Command, Air Force training officers, and gunnery specialists who'd been dismissing the deflection shooting proposal just weeks earlier. The room was tense. The demonstration footage was reviewed. The casualty statistics were discussed. The implications were stark. One training officer initially pushed back. "This violates our established doctrine. If we admit previous methods were inadequate, we undermine the credibility of our entire training apparatus." Blakesley responded calmly, but with an edge. "Sir, with respect, our doctrine is killing pilots. 3 weeks of additional gunnery training kills nobody, but flying against German fighters without this training, that's what kills pilots. The data speaks for itself." The room erupted. Voices overlapped. Concerns about training timelines, worries about pilot selection standards, arguments about doctrine versus pragmatism. Someone mentioned that implementing new tactics would essentially admit the Air Force had been training pilots inadequately for 3 years. General Doolittle stood up. He was quiet, which had the immediate effect of silencing everyone else. "Gentlemen, I don't care about doctrine," Doolittle said. "I care about coming home. I care about bomber crews surviving their missions. I care about winning this war, and I care about our pilots not dying because we're too stubborn to adopt superior tactics." He turned to Blakesley. "Colonel, I'm giving you authority to implement your training program across all fighter groups under my command. Full authorization, full resources. I want every pilot transitioning through Debden to complete your gunnery course. No exceptions." Then he added something else, something quieter. "And if anyone above my pay grade complains, Tell them I authorized it and they can take it up with me personally." The room erupted, but this time it was cheers, because everyone in that moment understood they'd just witnessed the future of air combat being born. The transformation was staggering. Within 4 weeks, over 200 pilots had completed Blakeslee's training program. Within 8 weeks, every fighter group in Veit Fighter Command had incorporated deflection shooting into standard curriculum. The K-14 computing gun sight, which helped calculate lead angles automatically, was retrofitted into every P-51 Mustang. The numbers told the story. Before deflection shooting implementation, the average American fighter pilot got approximately 2 kills before being killed or rotating home. German pilots averaged 7 kills. That ratio was unsustainable. It meant that for every German pilot who died, 3 American pilots died. The mathematics of attrition meant the Luftwaffe could continue grinding down American air power indefinitely. After deflection shooting training was implemented, the average American fighter pilot who completed the Blakesley training got 4.3 kills. Better pilots got 7. Exceptional pilots got double digits. The kill ratio flipped. For the first time, American fighter losses began dropping while German losses climbed. The big week came in February 1944. The Big Week, as it would be called in the history books. Operation Argument, a coordinated bombing campaign involving over 3,000 bombers and fighters aimed at German aircraft production facilities. 12 days of continuous combat operations. On February 21, 1944, Blakesley himself led a deep penetration escort mission to Regensburg, Germany. The sortie report details what happened. 437 B-17 bombers crossing the German border, their bomber streams stretching for miles. Escorting them, 208 fighters from the 4th Fighter Group and attached units. As the formation approached the target, German fighters rose to intercept. Major Dwayne Beeson, a 4th Fighter Group pilot trained under Blakeslee's deflection shooting program, was flying in the second wave. What happened next would become immortalized in combat film footage. And Me-109 approached from 2 o'clock, the side. Beeson banked toward it, estimating the closing speed at approximately 450 miles per hour, combined closing velocity. The German pilot was making an error, coming in too steep, too committed to the attack run. Beeson calculated the deflection angle, 45 degrees. He was traveling at 370 miles per hour. The German was traveling at 380. Time of flight for the bullet was approximately 0.3 seconds. In that time, the German aircraft would advance perhaps 150 feet. Beeson aimed ahead of the German fighter, ahead of where it was, directly at where it would be. He pressed the firing button for a 2-second burst. The gun camera footage shows the tragedy in perfect clarity, tracers converging on the Messerschmitt like a deadly spider's web. Strikes along the fuselage. Strikes through the wing root. The canopy disintegrated. The German pilot pitched forward, the fighter becoming a descending fireball. That was 1 kill. By the end of the big week, that single concept, deflection shooting, had fundamentally altered the air war. The statistics emerged over the following weeks. During Big Week, American fighter pilots downed 486 German aircraft. German fighters downed 71 American fighters. That was a 6.8 to 1 kill ratio. In the space of 12 days, the entire tactical balance of the European air war had inverted. American fighters were now hunters. German fighters were becoming hunted. But the statistics don't capture the human reality. Those numbers represent something more profound. American pilots were coming home. A bomber pilot named Robert Hansen, flying B-17 with the 398th Bomber Group, recorded this in his diary after February 22, 1944. The fighters today, our fighters, they were everywhere. I watched them push a German formation away from our formation, watched them slash into the enemy fighters with precision I haven't seen before. We didn't lose a single bomber today. Every man who was supposed to come home came home because of those pilots, because they finally learned to shoot. By April 1944, the transformation was complete. American bomber losses in daylight raids had dropped by 63%. The Luftwaffe, which had achieved such dominance in 1943, was now being systematically destroyed. And the pilot at the center of it all was still flying escort missions, still teaching gunnery theory to new pilots, still pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aerial combat. A German Luftwaffe pilot named Johann Steinhoff, a veteran who survived the war with 36 confirmed kills, was interviewed after the war. Asked about the sudden improvement in American fighter tactics, he said this: "In 1943, we knew we could shoot better than the Americans. It was not arrogance, it was fact. Their pilots would get lost. Their formations would break apart. They would spray bullets into the sky and miss. By mid-1944, this was gone. They began attacking with discipline. They began deflection shooting like we had been doing for 3 years. And they had more pilots, more ammunition, more courage. We knew then that the war was lost because we could not compete anymore." From that moment forward, American air superiority was never questioned again. Every bomber that flew to Berlin, to Munich, to Hamburg, they made it home because of pilots trained in deflection shooting techniques. We'll never know the exact number of lives saved by Blakesley's innovation, but if each pilot who survived one extra mission went on to father children who wouldn't have existed, the legacy extends into millions. After the war, Colonel Donald James Matthew Blakeslee was offered every honor the military could bestow. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross twice, one of the most decorated pilots in American history. Military academies wanted him to teach gunnery theory to the next generation of fighter pilots. He refused most of it. Blakesley retired from the Air Force in 1965 as a full colonel, but he never wrote a memoir. He never gave interviews about his revolutionary gunnery tactics. When historians began documenting World War II air combat, they'd request interviews. Blakesley would politely decline. Instead, he went home to Ohio. He worked in civilian aviation. He lived quietly. When the 4th Fighter Group held reunions, he'd attend, shake hands with the veterans, and listen to their stories, more than he told his own. Before he passed away in 2008, at age 90, Blakesley gave one final interview. When asked why he'd never sought the spotlight, he said, "A good commander doesn't take credit for his pilot's success. They do. Every kill belongs to them. Every pilot who came home, that's because they learned and they executed. I just showed them it was possible." By war's end, the 4th Fighter Group had become the top-scoring American fighter group in the entire European theater. They were credited with 1,020 aerial victories. 550 were air-to-air kills. 470 were ground attacks. The 4th's kill-to-loss ratio was approaching 8-to-1, the highest of any American fighter group in World War II. Those kills represented statistically around 3,000 German aircrews eliminated from combat permanently. It meant that the German Luftwaffe, which had begun 1943 with air superiority, ended 1944 as a force in tactical decline. The skies over Germany became increasingly contested and then increasingly dominated by American fighters. The deflection shooting techniques pioneered by Blakesley are still taught today. Modern fighter pilot training incorporates his fundamental principles. The American Air Force Academy references his methodology in their curriculum. NATO air forces use deflection shooting tactics that trace directly back to his innovations at Debden in 1944. But more importantly, Blakesley's approach to problem-solving transcends aviation. He saw a system that wasn't working. Instead of accepting that the experts said improvement was impossible, he looked at the data. He saw what worked in the enemy's approach and asked why Americans couldn't achieve the same results. He tested his theory rigorously. He proved it worked. And then he fought through institutional resistance to implement it. That's leadership. That's innovation. That's the mindset that wins wars. Colonel Donald Blakeslee died on September 3, 2008. He's buried in Arlington National Cemetery. His grave marker lists his decorations and his service record, but it doesn't capture the full measure of his legacy. Somewhere, a bomber crew survived a mission to Stuttgart because a fighter pilot learned Blakeslee's deflection shooting techniques. That fighter pilot came home. He had children. Those children had children. Generations of people exist because of one man's refusal to accept that improvement was impossible. That is the power of one person deciding to change the system.